in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Hey everybody, it's Buck Joffrey here with Sapio, and today we're just doing a little bit of a follow-up on the last pillar, the first pillar, which is basically food and nutrition type stuff, like what to eat and what not to eat and when. And I thought it might be a good idea before we get to the next pillar to get some questions answered. And so I've asked my executive producer, Ben here, Ben, thanks, to come in and basically kind of keep me honest and keep us honest here. So Ben, welcome to the front side of this show.
Yeah. Usually I'm in the back side.
Usually in the
hiding.
back side, yeah. But I think it was great. You know, it's a good idea to do this, I think, once in a while, because obviously Alan and I, we've been talking about this stuff. We're both physicians, and I think sometimes we take for granted the fact that we might be fast forwarding along a lot of basics. And I think the basics are really helpful in order for people to understand why something is important.
Right.
You know. So going back to our first show.
Well, I personally think the first show, I'm not a doctor.
And you don't play one on TV.
And I do not play one on TV
Yeah.
or on video. But I mean, the show was so interesting, but there was so much content in it. So I think if we can just have a quick conversation about glucose, because you guys were talking about that being like the big...
It was like the demon, right? Glucose is the killer. I believe that to be true as well. Well, where do we start? Let's start with basic physiology, right? Like, you know, what we learned in medical school and what exactly this whole blood glucose and insulin interaction is. So first of all, blood glucose is sugar, right? And so what happens is, so when we eat something, say we eat some broccoli or maybe we drink some fruit juice, whatever, that sugar gets broken down and absorbed in the intestine. Okay, now that's point one there that's really important. The location is the intestine, but you're absorbing. Now, what can happen there is it can absorb really fast. That ends up getting into the bloodstream really quickly. And we think of that, you know, people talk about high glycemic index types of things. That's what that means. Whereas you might have broccoli, which of course has some sugar, but it needs to be broken down. And by the time, you know, you get blood sugar in your stream, it's coming in kind of at a slow rate. So your overall blood sugar never gets really that high. So that's the one point. So now, once that blood sugar is actually in the blood, once that sugar is in the bloodstream, what you have to think about there is you've got this big, you've basically got this hit of sugar. Now, what are you going to do with it? The skeletal muscles, our muscles in the liver basically act as a reservoir for that blood glucose, but it doesn't come in there nice and easy. It requires insulin. Insulin basically is the key that opens up these cells and allows blood glucose to get into the cell. So if everything's working well, like you're young and healthy, you don't have any kind of diabetes or whatever, you basically get you get sugar in the system, insulin gets released from the pancreas in response to that, and then boom, it gets into this reservoir, which is a skeletal muscle or the liver, and it brings blood sugar back to normal, right? So that's basic sort of, glucose and insulin physiology. I should point out too that there's one little thing that I think, might be interesting to people, which is you might wonder sometimes why you eat and then you might get a little sluggish and tired. Because what happens is that insulin actually sometimes overshoots when it releases from the pancreas, so that blood glucose goes from a little bit high to normal, and then it goes a little extra low, and you get what's called hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar, and that's when you experience that fatigue and all that. The thing about it is, blood sugar, you have to have it, right? You're not going to live without it. It's a matter of, how much you have in your system.
Okay, so I do have questions on that. So, so you're saying you have to have it in the system. What happens if you don't have it in the system? I guess is in your blood.
Right. Well, that's a good question. Well, you're gonna end up needing some level of glucose in your body, right? It's some of the things that we use to burn on a daily basis. But I think the question is a good one, because you don't necessarily have to have glucose-rich food. Ultimately, your body can turn, certain types of other molecules into glucose that you can use. For example, in the case of like people who are on the ketone diet or something like that, right? Like keto diet, what they're trying to do is actually to keep their blood sugar low so that they preferentially start burning off fat, right? And that's kind of what the keto diet is. But you do need some blood sugar in order to function on a daily basis. The question is how much of it actually comes from your, ingestion, how much of it is changed. The other thing is, in reality, ingesting blood glucose is not a bad thing. It's like keeping it at a certain level. Because even if you're eating a type of diet that has really low glucose in it, you still need a certain level of glucose in the bloodstream. Otherwise, you're going to feel kind of bad, right?
Okay, so a question, one of the things you guys mentioned was you had the blood glucose monitor.
Yeah.
And I think it was I don't remember what you had, but it was a steak or broccoli, and your levels went up. But the next day you had a salad in advance, and it didn't go up as high. Like how does what you eat and when you eat affect things?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, and this is where I think we were talking about specifically on how those blood glucose monitors can help you figure out like how your body works. Because, you've probably heard about glycemic index for various foods, right? Yeah. So what that tells you is, again, how quickly your blood sugar is going to shoot up. You really don't want it to shoot up too much, right? But what we're finding through these glucose monitors is that not everybody's the same, which is not surprising, right? Like we're not all the same exactly on the outside. We're not exactly all the same on the inside. So for me, what was happening is that as long as I would, eat a salad, if I had a salad and steak, and then I had dessert, the dessert did not significantly spike my blood sugar. And so, you can go back and think, well, why might that be? Well, again, it goes back to your intestines are busy with other stuff at that point that's not metabolizing and getting absorbed super quickly. And then you put in this other dessert, and maybe maybe that's sort of acting as a little bit of a, like a guard, or like protecting the quarterback, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. So if you ate a spoonful of sugar on an empty stomach, I guess the logic would be.
Then like fruit juice, right?
Right.
If you're gonna have fruit juice, it's going to spike,
right?
Because there's nothing between the intestines but pure sugar.
So if I eat all the fruits that are in that juice as fruit versus throwing it in a blender and making juice, it's going to be a big difference.
Yes, it will. And that's still pretty high glycemic stuff, I think. But I think in reality, what you're saying there is, again, think about this is like if you had, with your intestines, how much of a barrier are you creating with the pure glucose that comes into the system? So if you've got a bunch of pulp, you've got a bunch of cellulose that's like included in this fruit, it's going to absorb slower.
Okay, so hyperglycemia, is that?
Hyperglycemia, it just basically means high blood sugar.
Okay, why is it bad? Like what's...
That's a great question. Yeah. Okay, because, especially like right now in this space, whether you're watching videos, you're listening to podcasts, I think you get a pretty good idea that high blood glucose is not a good thing, right? Yep. And that, by the way, that's what we call hyperglycemia. Hypoglycemia is low blood sugar.
Okay.
So hyperglycemia is bad. Why is it bad? The way I think about it, and I don't want to get too scientific on this, but I like to think of blood sugar as like sort of this sludge, right? This sludge in the system, that what ends up happening is that when you get too much of it in the system, it starts sliming everything, right? In technical terms, what we call that is glycation. proteins, like for example, well, we'll get to hemoglobin A1C, but proteins that are sitting that function to help you see in the retina, in the kidneys, they help you with your, just elimination of toxins and things like that. They get slimed by this stuff.
So it's like sticking.
It's sticky stuff. And so the technical term for that is glycation. Okay. And so what happens is these proteins get this glucose that sticks to them. That alters them just enough so they don't function as well. Some ways it's almost like rust, right? You think of things like kind of sitting out there getting rusty, and they're just, they don't work as well. So that's why I keep thinking about this as sludge coming down, and if you have too much sludge in the system, it's going to start sliming all these proteins, and that's what we're calling glycation. In the extreme case, you see that in diabetes, right? Where you have these, prolonged higher levels of hyperglycemia. And what do you see in patients with diabetes? Well, you see some of these damages to what we call end organ damage, right? So diabetic retinopathy, for example. People can go blind who have diabetes just because they have high circulating blood glucose, and it ends up like sticking to their retinas, and over time, they get a bunch of inflammation, the proteins get altered, and the next thing you know, they can go blind. One of the major things that you have to think about is glycation happens at the level of the blood vessels too. Okay. So if it happens to the blood vessels, we know that's likely why you've got an increased risk of cardiovascular disease in diabetics. Okay. But you also have kidney disease, which functions, the way that works is that the glycation happens in these small vessels of the kidneys and ultimately makes parts of the kidneys not get blood and die off. Kidneys,
what do? They clean?
Kidneys basically eliminate the toxins of the blood.
Okay.
Right. So and if if the kidneys aren't working on dialysis, you're in kidney failure, et cetera. So you have that. So bottom line is, again, I think of this whole process as getting slimed, and you want to minimize how much sludge you have in the system so that less and less of your body gets slimed. Now, here's the thing. People think, well, there's these normal levels and then there's diabetic levels. Okay, so we're talking about all this sludge and the glycation, right? So how do we know exactly how big of a problem we actually have? And so the answer to that, one answer to that, is something called hemoglobin A1C, right? So hemoglobin is the stuff in our blood cells. So it's like hundreds of thousands of these hemoglobin proteins within each blood cell. And what that does, normally, what it does is it transports oxygen, right? So that's the purpose of it. On a different note, essentially what happens is that hemoglobin A1C has been a really good surrogate to identify high levels of ongoing blood sugar. And the reason is that hemoglobin, when it gets glycated, when it gets slimed, it becomes hemoglobin A1C.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
That's what it is. Hemoglobin A1C is slimed.
Wow. Okay.
Hemoglobin.
Okay.
Right? So it gets glycated, it turns into hemoglobin A1C. So what you're looking at when you look at hemoglobin A1C is the percentage of hemoglobin that has actually been glycated. Okay. Right? So when you get a number like 6 or something like that, 6% of hemoglobin is hemoglobin A1C, and therefore you have an idea. So it's the higher that number is, the higher the average blood glucose is over a period of time. Remembering that these blood cells exist for about 120 days is their typical lifespan. So it gives you sort of not just a snapshot like a blood glucose with your labs does, but it gives you a visual of, maybe an average over a few months. So that's what's really important about it.
What would be considered a high number, I guess?
Yeah, so I think the diabetes number is like 6.5, I believe. And if I'm wrong, someone can write in. But the thing that's tricky though is you get into these numbers where there's pre-diabetes, and I think people think of that as somewhere between 6 or maybe it's 5.8 to 6.5. I don't remember the exact numbers, but there's pre-diabetes, and then there's the number between, pre-diabetes and, what might be a little bit higher than you want, right? But here's the thing, to me, you don't wait until those numbers are redlining, right? Because this diabetes is a disease we think about, but this whole process is not a discrete process. You have varying levels of blood sugar in the body. Yeah. So if you're generally running at a higher blood glucose and your hemoglobin A1C is 5.9, in my book, that's something I want to treat.
Is it the kind of thing that if I'm at a 5.9, I'm doing damage, just not as much damage?
I think of it as death by 1,000 cuts.
Okay.
Because even though you're not meeting some clinical criteria of diabetes, the same processes are happening in your body slower. And if you can control that, I think a lot of longevity docs would tell you that you really want to target close to 5.2 is a good number for hemoglobin A1C. Then you're going to be in better shape.
So you need to go get a test. That would be a good test. Is this a standard?
Yeah, hemoglobin A1C it's pretty much done by, you can get that at any one of your physician's office. The problem is, I think what happens is that, unless you show symptoms of diabetes, or, you do a simple set of labs and all of a sudden your fasting blood glucose comes back over 100, which is not what you normally see in non-diabetics, they're not going to work up anything, right? But again, understanding that this thing is a spectrum, not just you get here in your disease and before that you're totally normal, right? What we want to do is say, okay, blood glucose is not a good thing. We know that it slimes all these proteins. Let's bring it down to a level that we feel we're comfortable with. And that's kind of what that is.
Okay. I mean, I would say it's huge information. And I think, I do know some people that are pre-diabetic. I know, what's the difference between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, so most people don't really need to worry so much about type 1 diabetes. Okay, so going back to that process that we discussed of sugar metabolism, where you get the blood glucose comes in the intestines, it gets absorbed, insulin gets kicked out from the pancreas to unlock cells to let blood sugar go in, right? So type 1 diabetes is typically, it's not really clear what the mechanism is on that, except to say that the pancreas essentially fails to make adequate amounts of insulin. And usually that happens in childhood. People think maybe it's an autoimmune disease or something like that. That's type 1 diabetes, and that typically will require insulin replacement, that kind of thing. Type 2 diabetes, much more common. It's also highly genetic.
Okay.
There doesn't mean that you're going to get it for sure if you are disposed to it, but if you are disposed to it, you're going to have a much higher likelihood of getting it, right? Okay. Type 2 diabetes is essentially a type of diabetes where there is for some reason, there's insensitivity to the insulin. So in other words, that same hormone that comes and unlocks those cells and lets the glucose in, for some reason, that lock-in key mechanism is not working as well. And so, you may end up with more insulin, and that can create, for some other reasons that we're not clear, even more insulin sensitivity, and it creates
just cascading
this problem.
Okay. So
a lot of the best ways to avoid insulin sensitivity ultimately appears to be, first of all, eating well and trying to keep your blood glucose controlled. Obesity certainly seems to contribute. So if you are already prone genetically, you've got diabetes in your family, the time when you're going to see it is probably when you're going to, is when you start gaining weight.
Okay. Is that a precursor to diabetes? As you start gaining weight and you should be looking at why am I gaining weight?
I don't think the obesity itself is a precursor, because there's plenty of people who are obese who are not diabetics.
Is that true?
Yeah,
really?
That is true.
Oh, wow.
That is true.
Okay.
But I think if you have diabetes in your family and you're obese, then you're much more likely to end up a diabetic.
So you're saying don't wait until you're pre-diabetic. If your levels are high, you should be doing some so we're talking prevention versus treatment, right?
Yeah.
What would you be doing if your numbers were not as comfortable as you'd like them to be? What can I do?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, the biggest thing is, like exercise and diet, like just basic stuff, right? And one of the things, exercise is such a big thing. We'll keep coming back to this, but, exercise is a major, major preventative thing for diabetes. Same thing with nutrition. Listen, food is what we eat in this country on average is not a particularly healthy diet, right? And so and
our diet's now going into other countries and affecting.
Right. And if you think about it, like those like sodas and things like that, sweets, things like that are completely, you're just going to come in there and you're going to have a sugar explosion of sugar in your bloodstream, right? And having that kind of ongoing thing is devastating for your body, right? So I think so. That's first and foremost. The first thing is diet and exercise. I think the next level on this, by the way, the next level, the thing that I would do, and again, even being a physician, I'm not going to give any advice. I'm only going to tell you what I would do.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And that is, the next thing I would do is I would probably invest in some sort of continuous glucose monitoring system to try to figure out what the real issue is. If you've got, slightly elevated hemoglobin A1C, your doctor's saying, there might, you got to be careful here. You got to eat better and you got to exercise. What I would do is I'd get a monitor, because without data, you don't really know what you can do. You don't know if you're doing the right thing. Some people can eat rice and have no glycemic reaction to that at all.
You said that to Alan.
And some people can eat potatoes and not have that reaction. Others will have a big spike. Right. So trying to understand your own diet and what makes your own blood sugar spike, I think is really useful.
I just think it'd be interesting to know this stuff.
Oh, it's really interesting and liberating sometimes.
Maybe
right?
I can eat more cookies.
Or maybe, or you can eat your cookies after you have your dinner or
salad.
Right. Or maybe you have your apple cider vinegar, and then you have, that's another story entirely, right? But there's exercise, diet, monitoring. And then the last thing I think really is medications, right? And so, in the old days, and I think with traditional docs right now, they would really hesitate to put people on some of these medications like metformin or Jardiance or whatever for anything that is not considered clinical diabetes, right? But what we find, and what we're finding in the literature, is that there is potentially significant benefit in doing that. And so, again, not medical advice here at all, but if it's me and my hemoglobin A1C is 5.9 and, I'm dieting, I'm exercising, and I'm seeing a lot of spikes that I can't seem to control, my next step is, going on some kind of medication, because, again, to me, blood sugar and hyperglycemia is one of the, if not one of the biggest contributors to taking years off your life that there is.
One of the stories that I had heard as a kid, I think I was in 8th grade, my basketball coach always told us that not to drink sugary drinks. And we would argue with her and be like, no, when we drink sodas and stuff like that, it gives me lots of energy. And then she'd explain to us that, you have energy, but then you end up lower than when you started after. And I guess this is what's happening, right? Yep,
that's the insulin overshoot. Yeah, that's what happens. And so, it's funny that you mentioned that too, because, by the way, I'm wondering why you played basketball when you lived in Canada.
Yeah.
Because that's hockey season. So I don't know what happened there, but
small town basketball and volleyball. And I think we were a new boom town, and they couldn't afford to have football, and I played hockey too. But I know you played hockey.
I played ice hockey. So that's what I was getting to, is that I remember when I was a kid playing ice hockey, before games, they'd have us carb load. We'd even have like team dinners at an Italian restaurant and eat a bunch of spaghetti. And whenever we did that, I always felt awful.
Interesting. Why do they do it then?
Like, because we didn't know. We didn't really know. That's the bottom line. Is, Ellen and I talked about the food pyramid.
Yep.
And
that's true.
All of these things that we thought were the case that are not the case anymore.
Back to hockey. One thing that I do remember is we're in the playoffs right now, and a bunch of the first round games, they all went to overtime. And one of the things that I heard was that they were bringing in, pizza and basically junk food between the third period and overtime.
Yeah, maybe some juice.
So why are they doing that then?
Yeah, I mean, if you think back to, that whole concept that we had of like quick absorption versus slow absorption. In this situation, say you've got 2 minutes left in a game and you're exhausted, take something that you're going to get the maximum blow of blood sugar immediately so that you get that boost of energy, knowing that 2 minutes is over and you're going to feel awful afterwards.
Okay.
But it'll last you a couple minutes for sure.
Right. So that does make sense to me. Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I mean, I've learned a lot just sitting here and listening to you guys. I've learned a lot, but it's just nice to kind of narrow this down a little bit.
It's good. We should do this, after every major episode, I think, where we, hit a lot of concepts, because again, I'm a doctor, Alan's a doctor, he's a doctor, I'm a surgeon.
Yeah, there's just it's different. It's different.
It's different, but we tend to talk about things, and sometimes it's hard to make sure that we cover everything, because we want to make sure this is not just for people who are, already really into this stuff and are already like in the know about all this terminology. This is something that I'm really hoping that we are the cause of people sort of, pivoting their life and looking at these different things that we're talking about that know nothing about this right now. So
yeah, I think it's great. I think maybe the next one we can talk about is the glucose monitor, because I'm super curious about that.
Sure.
So
all right.
Okay.
Thank you. We'll see you next episode.